what's going on? We got the latest edition of the second half draft show. I'm your host, Juice. Been flying solo for several weeks now. I don't know where these cats are at, man. But life seems to be lifing. But happy to be with you this Friday evening. And obviously, we're going to talk a little football, NFL, college, and of course, the NFL draft, the 2026 NFL draft. Draft season is approaching. Matter of fact, I got a text from the homie from the family, DP, and he was just mentioning, man, where you guys been, man? It's almost draft season, and I have to agree with him. We've been MIA, but certainly trying to get back on the horse. A lot has transpired over the last couple of weeks. The NFL trade deadline has come and gone. It was a fairly eventful trade deadline. We'll unpack some of that, get a sense of what that means ahead of the 2026 NFL draft. And then, of course, we'll always take a look at the college football slate and make mention of players that seem to pique our interest or certainly helping themselves. And, of course, those who may not necessarily be bolstering their stock. So I actually want to start with the trade deadline and what it means for the NFL teams, presumably. But certainly, with the backdrop of the NFL draft, what does that mean, right? What type of impact do we think the trade deadline will have on various teams heading into the 2026 offseason, ultimately the 2026 NFL draft? So, with that said, let me share screen here so we can take a look. And obviously, there's been quite a few trades this season, even prior to the trade deadline. But I do want to focus, I do want to place an emphasis on what transpired right around the trade deadline. So let's get it started here. All right. And I will put myself here so we can get a little bit better view of things. But if you go back to, let's say, the beginning of November, right? There was a move that Philadelphia made to acquire cornerback one, from that particular draft class, at least according to Couch Potato general manager Jair Alexander. There was a late pick swap associated with that deal. And most recently, I think it was either today or yesterday, Jair Alexander is actually stepping away from football. So there's certainly something going on there. It did not work out in Baltimore. Philadelphia figured, you know what? Let's kick the tires, see if we can add, a player who has, played at a fairly high level when he's been healthy. But I suspect there's some off the field situations that Alexander is trying to work through. So this one didn't necessarily materialize in anything, but it does highlight, at least in my mind, an area where even though Baltimore moved off of Alexander, I think their secondary, when you think about the names in their secondary, you would expect them to play at a higher level. I think part of that is a byproduct of the fact that their pass rush has been inconsistent. And of course, they made a move to add a pass rusher, and we'll get to that momentarily. Our guy, safety from Georgia, Malachi Starks, coming into his own now. Obviously, really effectively no longer a rookie, really coming into his own now, starting to make plays on that back end. Kyle Hamilton obviously has been playing at a high level for a while now. Nate Wiggins, another young defensive back, first round pick. He's playing fairly well, and even Chidobe Awuzie has played better as of late. Marlon Humphrey in the slot, plays in the boundary. He to me in my mind, if Humphrey is playing at a high level, this group can be really good. It can be really good. But of course, despite the talent on the back end, I think the main question mark associated with the Ravens is pass rush. And where's it going to come from? How are we going to effectively affect the quarterback on a consistent basis? And they traded Odafe Owe early in the season. Now, Owe has been has certainly gotten better over the years. And in fact, he put together a double-digit sack season. But clearly, the Ravens didn't think they were getting enough from him this year. And I don't know that he's done enough over the course of his career to warrant the big time, long-term extension. So they moved off of him earlier in the season. Kyle Van Noy had a wonderful year last year, but he's dealt with injury, a year older, obviously a player longer in the tooth. He has struggled, right? Mike Green, very talented pass rusher out of Marshall. He's a rookie, right? So he's he's getting ramped up. He's playing more now, starting to make more plays, which is a good sign. But I think the Ravens, long term, going into the offseason 2026, I think they got to get better in terms of the pass rush. And this has been the case for a while now. I think they had like everything was going well a season ago, and perhaps that may have skewed the perception as it relates to the Ravens pass rush. But I just don't know that they consistently affect the quarterback. And that's just not sacks. That's about moving the quarterback off his spot, hurries, pressures, all of that plays into the back end, the back seven, and certainly the secondary playing at a higher level because there's no shortage of talent in that secondary, as far as I'm concerned. They should be forcing more turnovers. They should be making more plays, getting those short fields for that offense. Of course, Lamar's back healthy. So, yeah, we're talking cornerback, we're talking defensive back here with this particular trade. But I think when you talk about the totality of the Ravens defense in particular, certainly the pass rush, I think really, makes everything go as it relates to that defense. It's certainly the back end of the defense. On the other end of that spectrum of this particular trade, again, Philadelphia, Howie Roseman, certainly no stranger to making a move. I think the way he churns his roster is really impressive. I think that front office collectively does a great job. And, it's kind of low risk, high reward, right? You bring in Jair Alexander. Perhaps he's motivated to play for, a championship caliber team. It just didn't materialize, unfortunately. But I really like the thought process here. I really like the thought process here. And again, I think the Eagles will be in the market. They obviously benefited from doubling down in the secondary this past draft with Quinyon Mitchell, the 2024 draft with Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. So, I think they recognize, having had some injuries, having had some roster turnover, they needed to add more pieces here. We got to have a certain level of depth to get through, a very long season where there's a lot of attrition. And I think stockpiling defensive backs, pass rushers, right? I'll get to pass rusher here for the Eagles as well. Not unlike the Ravens, I think that is the mark of a quality, forward-thinking front office. Again, this particular trade won't bear fruit necessarily unless Alexander comes back in the coming weeks. But certainly, I really like the thought process here. And, I wouldn't be surprised that when we get to the draft in 2026, Philadelphia goes back to the well in terms of adding, some high upside players, guys that may not necessarily have to play right away, but have some unique physical tools, gifts, and get them in their program and continue to develop them. All right. What you got here, Mrs. C? Ravens will sign Boye Mafe in the offseason, in my opinion. Not a bad thought. Not a bad thought, right? I wonder what you think that does as far as Seattle is concerned, right? I know Seattle has a lot of names, a lot of players in the mix. But I think Nwosu, I'm not sure if he's under contract beyond this year, right? If Mafe is on the move, what does your edge rush kind of look like under those circumstances? All right, let's keep it going. Okay, so I made mention, I alluded to it. Harry Roseman, Philadelphia, again, a lot of roster turnover, attrition that tends to happen when you have a season like the Philadelphia Eagles did have a year ago. Guys that want to cash in, players who played more of a complementary role, they have to step up and play more stats. And Philadelphia, for the balance of this season, haven't had the kind of pass rush we had become accustomed to over the last several seasons, right? That had been their hallmark. Of course, they got better, much better, younger on the back end with the Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJeans and so on and so forth. And most recently they drafted Makuba, who's going to be a good one in his own right. But you still got to affect the passer. At the end of the day, with the rules obviously skewed to the offense, if you can't affect the passer, you're not going to be able to have sustained success. And Philadelphia struggled to get after the pass on a consistent basis for most of this season, right? The loss of Milton Williams, and you got no Josh Sweat. When you have that level of roster turnover, Brandon Graham, I think maybe coming back, but he had been retired. When you have that kind of roster turnover and guys are no longer pinch hitting for you, right? You could see a player come off the bench, play 20, 25 snaps, and look really good. Look really, really good, really impressive. when that snap count gets closer to 45, 50, those guys aren't as effective a lot of the times. Those part-time players, those secondary, tertiary guys on the depth chart, they don't always rise to the occasion. So, of course, Howie Roseman and company, they go out and they trade for Jalen Phillips, whom is a talented pass rusher in his own right. Has struggled with injuries throughout his entire football career. Doesn't necessarily matter the level, but you got a Miami Dolphins team that clearly needs to rebuild. They fire their GM Chris Greer. They seemingly playing for Mike Macdonald. They knock off the Bills and took care of them pretty handedly this past Sunday, but certainly I think it makes sense. You weren't going to go, give Phillips an extension. You get a day 2 pick for him. It makes sense for both teams in my mind. Good move here. And again, Eagles thinking ahead, trying to cash in, even if they don't necessarily extend him. Now you're talking about potentially a compensatory pick when he does hit free agency. It's just a smart move. It just makes sense at the end of the day. All right. Keep it going here as we talk a little bit about the NFL trade deadline and the impact, the perceived impact associated with the 2026 NFL draft. Derek Hall already kind of took his spot. You're right about that, Mrs. C. You're right about that. But I think you just need more bodies, right? You know as well as I know when the Legion Boom was at its height, the most effective I thought that defense was, of course you think about Wags and Sherman and Thomas, Cam Chancellor, and it was that 6 to 8 man rotation that they had up front and their ability to affect the pass. It wasn't a bunch of guys. It wasn't 1 or 2 guys with 12 to 14 sacks. It was like 6 guys with 8, 9 sacks. You know what I mean? So I in my mind, I think that's the way you want to build your team. It's great to have an individual who can get you 18, 20. You know what I'm saying? Have one of those special type seasons, defensive player of the year type seasons. But when you got waves of pass rushers, it makes it very challenging on the opposition. Mike Macdonald, or not Mike McDonald, actually Mike Macdonald, he really has that defense humming there in Seattle. So yes, Derek Hall certainly, is taking the spot of Boye Mafe, but I think Seattle will need to continue to add teeth to their pass rush, certainly in this upcoming offseason. Draymond Jones. So again, they move off of Oweh earlier in the season. Tennessee is a team that clearly isn't very good. They got to build that thing around Cam Ward, right? I think it's a multi-year project. Unfortunately, they've already gotten rid of their head coach. I was having this conversation with Headley and Drew via chat maybe a week ago, and the Titans, it was just a bad decision. Bad decision to move off Mike Vrabel. They got rid of Ran Carthon. Like, I don't understand the decision-making process with the Tennessee Titans. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, you don't have a whole lot to play for. When you talk about edge rushers, that's an area that Tennessee certainly needs to improve on. They let Harold Landry walk. He's now, in New England, and New England, behind the play of their very talented young quarterback. It's been a resurgence of the New England Patriots. New England Patriots are back, right? Led by Mike Vrabel. Yes, Mr. C, they absolutely did. They absolutely did. The Titans came out on the short end, and it was a bad decision, bad business move to move off of Mike Vrabel. It didn't make any sense. You weren't getting a proven commodity that had accomplished anything to the degree of Mike Vrabel. So it just didn't make sense to me. I guess they thought it was stale, and decided to move on. And to New England's credit, but the Draymond Jones edition. Again, I talked about the Ravens and their pass rush been inconsistent, depending on young players like Ojabo, certainly Mike Green, as well as veterans like Kyle Van Noy, who may not necessarily be playing at the same level that he did a season ago. You bring in Draymond Jones, and that certainly helps. That certainly helps bolster your pass rush, bolster your defense. So, again, makes sense for both teams here. I just mentioned Tennessee has to figure out how to affect the passer. It's the name of the game. You got to protect your quarterback, and you got to affect the opposing team's quarterback. That's the name of the game. So, in my mind, and I wonder, I think the Titans will probably end up with a top 1 or 2 pick when it's all said and done, perhaps top 3. there are going to be several teams that are in the market for a quarterback, and I think some of those players are starting to kind of present themselves. Very different from what we thought entering the college football season, but certainly there's a couple of guys that have kind of risen to the top. Uh, of the mindset that we need to do whatever is in the best interest of Cam Ward, right? You would hope, you would like to maximize the rookie deal, but the reality is that you want your first overall pick, ton of talent, incredible leader. You want to put him in position to be successful first and foremost, right? So that's kind of my mindset. But do you have a receiver? Do you have a tackle? That you think is worthy of a top three pick, top two selection? I don't know that there is, right? And I think because of the breadth of needs Tennessee has on both sides of the ball, it would behoove them to trade down. I think they certainly need to trade down. And again, the trade of Draymond Jones allows them to add some draft capital. And that has to be the mindset. A little bit earlier in the season, maybe a month ago, they traded away a player that I loved coming out and has had a very good season. Good landing spot for him. Roger McCreary, their nickel. He's now in Los Angeles. So they have moved assets to acquire draft capital, right? And I think clearly the 2025 draft, to me, there's more talent on the defensive side of the ball, to be perfectly frank. But you gotta give Cam some help. Whether that comes in the form of a concerted effort within the draft to add talent, or you open up those purse strings and you go heavy in free agency, whatever the strategy consists of. I like the idea of adding additional draft capital, take as many swings at it as you possibly can, but they certainly have to do a better job around Cam Ward. Okay. The Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas kind of surprised me because going into the trade deadline, they're coming off a loss, I believe, to Arizona the last time they played, and they went into their bye week. I wasn't sure if they were going to be buyers, having had that loss on a Monday night. Right? They're a middling team. They've been a middling team for a couple decades now. So I didn't anticipate them to be buyers, but I think in true Jerry Jones fashion, of trying to grab the headlines, they made a couple deals, and I like them. I like the moves that they made. Right. On the one hand, they acquired Logan Wilson for a 7th round pick, which, in my mind, makes a ton of sense for the Cowboys. Right. I'm not sure what the Bengals are doing. Of course, they get something for Logan Wilson. They've gone young at linebacker. They got Demetrius Knight out of South Carolina and Barrett Carter out of Clemson. They're letting the young guys play, which team that we're not expecting to be, competing for a playoff spot. Joe Burrow got hurt early in the year. You want to see what those young guys have. Fine. Logan Wilson still can play football as far as I'm concerned. Right. And Dallas certainly needs to improve their defense at every level. It's a bad group. It's a poor group. Unfortunately, the young man, Marshawn Nealon, is no longer with us. He was kind of figured to be part of this young group of defensive linemen, front seven players, and of course that certainly is no longer the case. The Michael Parsons trade, they needed to add teeth. They needed to add players who are actually capable of getting the ball carrier on the ground. So I like the addition of Logan Wilson. I think he still has some good football in him, and you get him for a 7th round pick. The Bengals, I'm going to come back to the Bengals. I'll come back to the Bengals. But as far as the Cowboys are concerned with respect to this trade, it makes a lot of sense. They also, I'm going to skip here, they also added Quinnen Williams at the deadline, right? So with the Michael Parsons trade, they were able to bring in quite a bit of draft capital. They had a good haul, additional 1st round pick next year, in not just 2026, but in 2027. So they offered up their 2nd round pick in 2026, one of their 1st round picks in 2027, and Mozzie Smith, who has not panned out, right? Former 1st round pick at defensive tackle for Quinnen Williams. And Dallas has been trying. They've been trying to figure out the interior of their defensive line. And they just haven't had the kind of success necessary in order to allow some young pass rushers. We think we have some upside, certainly Donovan Ezraku, let those guys kind of develop and do their thing on the edge. They needed to get better along the interior defensive line, stop the run, affect the passer from the interior. Quinton Williams is capable of that. It soured quickly in New York. New York, obviously, fire sale, very bad football team. Probably will end up with the first pick in the draft. Um, for whatever reason, Aaron Glenn and Quinton Williams did not see eye to eye for whatever reason. So here's the trade. The Jets get significant draft capital, and maybe perhaps they're able to kind of rehabilitate Mozzie Smith. So I wasn't expecting it with these two teams per se. I knew Quinton Williams had been potentially on the block. He had requested a trade, but I didn't expect Dallas to be, again, as I mentioned, a buyer at the trade deadline. And of course, they make the deal, which I like for Dallas. I think Quinton Williams, Logan Wilson, being very strong, stout through the middle of your defense goes a long way. Let's see what you got here, Mrs. C. I think the Dolphins should keep their coach and let him go at it with the quarterback that isn't Tua. It's an interesting thought. I think McDaniel certainly would have no shortage of suitors as far as, play calling is concerned. He is a creative play caller from that Shanahan tree. So certainly it would have a ton of opportunities there. It kind of depends on how they finish, in my mind, right? And then, of course, new GM will come in. You want to make sure that there's synergy in terms of the quarterback position, the head coach, and the GM. I would imagine the GM would want to be able to explore, another quarterback. Now, is Mike McDaniel willing to, separate himself from Tua, because he hitched his wagon to Tua. He was part of rehabilitating Tua's confidence, and he hitched his wagon to him. So is he prepared to move on from Tua? That would kind of be the question. So very interesting dynamic there, but I really do think it depends on how the Dolphins finish, how they play for Mike McDaniel. All right, let's back up a little bit here. Talked about Dallas, a pair of trades that they made, big splash at the deadline. You got the Jags and the Raiders, right? And Travis Hunter has been shut down for the remainder of the season. So that's a tough blow. He was just coming into his own on the offensive side of the ball. Brian Thomas Jr. has been a disappointment. When I watched Brian Thomas Jr. play, obviously he had a tremendous rookie season. Sophomore slump. He's had a sophomore slump. And one of the things that jumps out to me when I watch him play is that the play strength has to improve. His physicality at the catch point is almost non-existent. If the defensive back is in phase and challenges him, he's not coming down with the football. And I don't expect him in those instances to come down with every catch. I don't think that's realistic. But certainly, a player with his kind of, height and athleticism, you would expect to turn some of those 50-50s into maybe a 60-40, 70-30, and oftentimes it's just an incompletion, right? Staying on your feet, being physical, not getting off your, knocked off your route at the top of the stem. Like these are areas that he has to be much better in. So the Jaguars, they're kind of in an interesting spot. They certainly have their eyes set on the playoffs, of course, coming off a tough loss to the Texans. Jakobi Meyers, was kind of languishing in Vegas. Geno Smith, Mrs. C, all about Geno Smith, hadn't been playing particularly well. He's languishing. The Raiders are going young. They're going young around, play their young players, see what they got. They moved Jakobi Meyers, and I think, that 4th and 6th round that you see there, I think is some pretty strong draft capital in return for Jakobi Meyers. The Jaguars, hopefully they can get him acclimated into the offense quickly, and he can start to pay dividends. Again, that Travis Hunter loss is it's huge, right? Obviously what he does, playing on the defensive side of the ball as a defensive back in a league where, you don't have a ton of great defensive backs, certainly helps. But the way he was starting to really come on as a receiver, moving into that receiver one role, I had maintained that, I would like to see him play the majority of the defensive snaps, because it's just harder to find DBs who can play the football, who have those types of ball skills, right? And then moonlight on the offensive side of the ball, right? When you get inside the 20, now you want that body control, those ball skills on the offensive field. But they just did not have enough consistent receiving play. So he started playing more and more snaps on the offensive side of the ball. And again, he really started to take to it at the NFL level, because the one area I thought he needed work in was his route running, right? Becoming more polished route runner. And that's only going to happen with more reps. And you could see him, the light bulb coming on, and him starting to play fast, right? Let his athletic gifts kind of take over. Goes down to injury, now on IR, will miss the remainder of the season. Parker Washington, whom I've always felt was a underutilized talent on this team, has stepped up quite a bit. So hopefully that trio of Thomas, Myers, and Parker Washington is enough to kind of get the Jags over the hump. But overall, I think this is a good trade, particularly for the Raiders. You know, you never know when you acquire a skill position player like this, how they get acclimated into the offense, right? Sometimes it takes time. That there's a lack of chemistry with the quarterback, that it takes time to kind of develop that rapport. There are obviously instances where that's not the case, where, you know, guys hit the ground running, but that's typically not how it works. So hopefully Myers can make an impact. But I like the trade for the Raiders. He wasn't being utilized, and certainly the Raiders aren't going anywhere just yet. So add some draft capital there. Okay. So we talked about the Jets, and we thought, you know, there might even be more players get traded by the Jets. I heard that Garrett Wilson was untouchable. He's another player who I think needs to improve his play strength. Right, super talented, you know, really intriguing prospect, young player still. Obviously, plenty of time to kind of, you know, become his final form, but certainly I think needs to be strong at the catch point. He goes down to injury. I think he just got moved to the IR, re-aggravated injury after missing a couple of weeks. Apparently, he was untouchable, right? So Quentin Williams, we talked about, thought Breece Hall might be on the move during the trade deadline. At the trade deadline, I heard that there were rumors around maybe KC being interested. If Kansas City calls, you hang up the phone. Hang up the phone, right? But I don't know that keeping Breece Hall, you know, was necessarily the right move. You know, notwithstanding the Kansas City being the main team interested, right? I think Breece Hall going. I believe this is a contract year for him. You know, running back. You try to get something for him, and maybe that comes in the form of a compensatory pick. But the big trade here, another big trade splash, was the addition of a pair of first round selections from the Indianapolis Colts, right? The Colts have been looking for, you know, that top defensive back, that guy who can, you know, potentially travel and take away the opposing team's top receiver. The Colts decided to push their chips in the middle of the table, and they acquired Sauce Gardner from the Jets. Now, Sauce has been good, not great in my mind over the last couple of seasons, right? And um certainly in man coverage, which I thought was one of the areas that he certainly excelled when he was in Cincinnati, and he certainly has good film. There's no question about that, yeah, at the professional level, but just not the consistency that I had hoped for. And Mississippi Practice said, you know, Sauce is overrated. He just inconsistent in terms of his technique. I think this system in Indianapolis is a great fit for him. I think Sauce, you know, being able to play in a deep third, keep his eyes on the quarterback and the ball, can make more plays on the ball that way. I think his length and athleticism certainly give him the opportunity to make plays on the football if he understands where he's at. And I think there's perhaps a little less emphasis in terms of his technique, which, you know, at times kind of falters. So I think the landing spot makes a lot of sense. Now the question is, did Indianapolis overpay? And I think based on Mr. C. Preskey's opinion of Sauce being overrated, he might say, yeah, I think this was steep. I think this was steep. I think the actual contract itself isn't bad, all things considered, but a pair of first round picks for a corner who may not necessarily have been playing great football, you know, decent to good, but not great football. And then Adonai Mitchell, who had fallen out of favor with the coaching staff, right? And actually got a chance to watch him a little bit during the Thursday night game. And of course, you know, statistically wasn't a really great game, but you could see his ability to create separation. He was matched up with Christian Gonzalez and did a pretty good job of creating separation, right? It was just a matter of the ball actually getting to him and Justin Fields having his struggles and so on and so forth. But I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued that it certainly was an area where the Jets needed to add some more talent. Right? You mentioned Garrett Wilson, but it just kind of been Garrett Wilson and really nothing else. You know what I mean? So teams are able to kind of take him away. And as I mentioned, Garrett Wilson could stand to get a little bit stronger and be more competitive in those 50-50 type of situations. But Adonai Mitchell, to me, now we're talking about going into 2026, an intriguing pair of young receivers that can make plays, that can stretch the field, make plays at every level. Mitchell has a little bit different body type, slightly different body type, a little bit taller as well, give you a bigger target there in the red zone. So I like the addition. I like the move for the Jets. It wasn't working. It wasn't working with Sauce. It wasn't working with Quinnen Williams. It's time for a hard reset right now. Of course, they have to make good on these selections, but the time will tell. Time will tell ultimately whether or not the Jets, whom have issues organizationally, ownership, they have their issues, are able to actually cash in on all of the draft capital that they've amassed here at the trade deadline. Justin Fields said JSN turned 50 balls into 90-10. Listen, man, I fully understand why those very talented Ohio State receivers said that JSN was the best among them, right? The Olaves, the Wilsons, that JSN was the guy. He was the cream of the crop. You know what I mean? So yeah, man, JSN's the real deal. And again, he plays to me with the requisite physicality at the catch point. You know what I mean? You're not going to knock him off the catch point. You're not going to rough him up, at the top of the stem, and then he can't concentrate on the football. You know what I mean? So you got a good one right there, Mrs. C. Definitely got a good one. Great. Let's take a look here. Keep it going. Speaking of your Seattle Seahawks, they had Rashid Shaheed, which excuse me, I love it. I love it. Seattle has some injuries in their receiving room with Torrey Horton, who was just kind of coming on. He was just starting to really come on. He goes down to injury. Cooper Kupp obviously has struggled to stay healthy. Rashid Shaheed is a player, man. You talk about the New Orleans Saints, and I think certainly, top to bottom, there's a dearth of talent, but Shaheed was one of the good ones on that team. Again, another team that I'm anticipating picking in the top 5, perhaps top 3. It's about amassing draft capital. Shaheed, all likelihood going into a contract year. You get something for him. A 4th and a 5th, I think is certainly worth the price of admission because the attrition, the roster attrition, the injuries that Seattle is amassing, they needed to add some reinforcements to their receiving room, and I think Shaheed is as good a addition you could potentially make. At the deadline, his ability to stretch the field on top of what JSN is doing. You got the tight ends Barner and Arroyo making plays in the short to intermediate. You got a pair of backs there, Darnold playing at a fairly high level. Like I really like this decision. This was a very shrewd pickup here at the trade deadline, and hopefully Shaheed and Darnold can find that rapport quickly. Horton has 60 and Cubby basically a coach on the field. Hey man, listen, it takes all types. It takes all types. Trying to get JPJ from the Raiders. Ooh. Yeah, I wouldn't do that if I'm the Raiders. And I think he got hurt, if I'm not mistaken, but I wouldn't do that. To me, that makes no sense, right? You're trying to build your roster up, and you got a young, center guard type that could be a mainstay on your offensive line for 8 to 10 years. You don't do that, especially just drafting a running back. Now, mind you, I love Ashton Jeanty. Love Ashton Jeanty. Love him down. The problem I have with the Jeanty selection to the Raiders is the fact that your rest of your roster is not ready for a first-round running back, right? And if this is true, if there was any actual legs to this potential trade, that to me is just bad roster building because you just invested in a running back in the first round in the top 10. You have a quarterback that's mid 30s, hasn't necessarily had a ton of success. Throws a pretty ball, don't get me wrong. Gino can spin it, but hasn't had a ton of success in his career. And we're off. We're moving assets that are under contract beyond the 2025 season, right? Along the offensive line, one of your better offensive linemen. That makes no sense to me. But would have been a hell of a move if the Seattle was able to pull that off. Okay, next up we got the Bears, and at the deadline they added Joe Tryon Shoyinka. That's Drew's guy. So the Bears obviously trying to add some depth to their pass rush rotation with this selection. The Browns, pick swap. They move up into the 6th round, give up a 7th. Kind of a ho hum trade as far as I'm concerned. But I mentioned it earlier. I think it's important. Teams that generally go deep into the playoffs, they tend to have a fairly robust pass rush rotation, right? And Shoyinka, who has never truly lived up to the 1st round billing, is a decent rotational piece. He's a solid rotational piece. So I like it from that perspective. And again, the Browns, they're able to move up a bit in the 2026 draft. Talked about the Quentin Williams deal. I think the last one that I want to touch on, another trade here for the Jets, but last one I want to touch on here is the Saints again. Once again, that they're involved in a trade, and they send Trevor Penning out west. And we talked about Penning a lot during the year that he came out, and we saw him live at the Senior Bowl, and you saw the physicality and how he got after it in the running game, small school product. How would he transition to the NFL? Did he have the pass rushing, or not pass rushing, excuse me, the pass blocking technique? Still remains to be seen. Still remains to be seen. They had been playing him at guard. He is a pretty good run blocker, but excuse me, his inconsistency in terms of pass protection, I think, is always going to be an issue, unless, of course, Jim Harbaugh and company are able to kind of rehabilitate him. I'm not sure if the Chargers plan on extending him. They acquire him for a 6th round pick. I think certainly the Chargers needed the depth. Joe Alt, whom has been, as advertised, he goes down to injury. Rashawn Slater obviously went down to injury earlier in the year. It's just that the Chargers can't seem to stay healthy. They can't seem to field the same 5 guys along their offensive line for any period of time. So they add Penning to the mix, I think, to bolster that group and hopefully stabilize things. I'm not sure exactly how effective it will be, but time will tell. Time will tell with respect to that, right? The Saints, as I mentioned, add the 6th round pick there. Makes sense. We're expecting a lot of roster turnover for the Saints over the course of the next couple of seasons. They're an older roster, not great cap situation, so they need to add draft capital for sure. All right. Let's transition here. Let's transition here and take a look at this week's slate in college football. Let's talk a little bit of college football. Hey, Mr. C, man, I saw your Huskies, man. They took one on the chin, man. What happened? What happened, man? Can't be worse than Anthony Bradford, and it ain't so bad. He can't even see the field. I think Haynes has to play center. I think he has to play center at the end of the day, unfortunately. Yeah, let's talk a little college football here. So currently, Clemson and Louisville are at it. I need Clemson to pull the upset. That'd be great. That'd be phenomenal for my Canes. And then, of course, Minnesota and Oregon are also playing out in Eugene. So a couple of conference games here with ACC and Big Ten. I want to take a look at the Saturday slate, and I have to talk about Indiana, man. Got to talk about Indiana. Indiana was ripe for the picking, right? Penn State was playing good football. They had Indiana in the crosshairs, to pull the big upset, and got to give it to them. This team has a certain grit to it. Excuse me. This team has a certain grit to it, and Fernando Mendoza, when in that pressure moment when you had to have it, right? He puts a drive together. He makes a throw under pressure. Great, amazing catch, I believe, by Cooper, the receiver. But just finding ways to make plays when it matters most. He threw a pick late in the game that you thought that might be it, that might do it. He did not let that phase him. I think those are the types of things. Those are the types of games, drives that not just develop characters, but starts to kind of define who that player is. And when you don't get too high or too low, and you're able to kind of bounce back and not let it snowball, I think that's the markings of a really good quarterback, and having that appropriate nervous system in crunch time. So currently Mendoza is in the pole position among the quarterbacks, man. I was a little bit later to the party, but having watched him in the closer contests, not the blowouts, not when everything is going perfectly, but the game earlier this year against Iowa. Iowa's a tough out. The Iowa played them really well. Iowa, in fact, punched Indiana in the mouth. They were able to come away with that win. You go out to Eugene, and Mendoza didn't have his best game, but when they needed it, when they had to have it, he made the plays, right? Same thing in Happy Valley. Like I to me, that is impressive to go on the road in those hostile environments, not necessarily have your best stuff, and still find a way to win. Crunch time, play your best, your best football, raise your level of play. Yeah, he's QB1 for me for sure. Um, Another team that is having a great year, Mike Elko has Texas A&M humming. They're humming. You know what I mean? You talk about how the SEC has a tendency to kind of beat itself up, cannibalize itself. Doesn't seem to be affecting Texas A&M this year. Both sides of the football. We talked about a lot about Cassius Howell coming into this year. He's obviously playing at a high level as well. So Marcel Reese and company, they are getting it done. They are getting it done. Texas A&M, again, going to be a tough out. South Carolina, a disappointment. Lenore Sellers has shut it down. I'm hearing rumors perhaps transferring to Miami. Drew sent me the text earlier today. I'll take that. I'm ready to move on. Life after Carson Beck. So certainly open to that. But really disappointing season for South Carolina. South Carolina always has NFL talent on their roster, but they just can't seem to put it together and string enough wins together to make some headway in the SEC. So Lenore Sellers making a business decision here, shutting it down and entering the transfer portal. The Notre Dame-Pittsburgh game is a significant one. I think you got some good running backs in this particular matchup. Pittsburgh, man, I know Notre Dame is favored by 12.5, 2 scores, but Pittsburgh is just one of those teams that throws a wrench in your season, man. They just have a knack for it. I do expect Notre Dame to come away with the win if they do the right thing and they feed Jeremiah Love and Price. They shouldn't necessarily have a problem here, but you just got to be careful, especially on the road against Pittsburgh. Michigan Northwestern, I expect Michigan to win. Justice Haynes has been terrific this year. Basham and company on the defensive side of the ball. Just want to see Bryce Underwood continue to get better. Want to see him continue to make those incremental steps in his play. South Florida, shout out to the alumni, my former college, my undergrad years. South Florida just needs to keep winning. They could find their way into the college football playoffs if they just keep winning. Got to keep winning. Let's see what else we got here. I don't know that there's anything else that really piques my interest in terms of that 12 o'clock window. Of course, we've had a number of head coach firings, right? Including Brian Kelly of LSU. I think it's getting ugly, right? I think LSU is trying to avoid paying the buyout money, and now Brian Kelly is going to court or whatever the case may be. Not a good look. Not a good look for LSU. Alabama, Oklahoma. Alabama has seemingly found their stride. Now, I'm a little surprised at this line, -6.5. I thought it might be a little bigger, but then again, Oklahoma's ranked 11th. Mateer's back in the lineup. Ty Simpson is trying to make his case as to be the first quarterback off the board. And I had a chance to watch some of Ty Simpson's game last week. And they were playing LSU, by the way, and saw Garrett Nussmeier get pulled in that one. And you just talk about a guy that just kind of fell off the face of the earth, unfortunately. Not a good look for him. But I wasn't thoroughly impressed by Simpson. Now, LSU has a really good defense. Don't get me wrong. LSU has a terrific defense. But I thought the areas where Ty Simpson, is supposed to or has throughout the majority of the season excelled, he did not have his best stuff. last weekend. Right, ball placement was a little sporadic. Um, the ability to kind of cycle through and process what's happening seemed a bit shaky. So I want to see how he bounces back. Oklahoma fields a pretty good defense, so want to see how Ty Simpson bounces back. I'll be tuning into that one for sure. Texas Tech, uh, listen, man, they got the horses. They got the horses. Did a great job in the transfer portal. We talked a lot about David Bailey, Romello Height here at Couch Potato General Manager, the second half draft show in particular. Can they keep it going? Can they avoid stubbing their toe against UCF? My Canes play NC State. I'm worried. I am concerned. I am concerned. Miami is favored by 14 and a half, but Miami has a tendency to play down to the competition. And I don't even consider it playing down to the competition. I think NC State on any given Saturday can beat just about anyone in the country. I think their quarterback, CJ Bailey, who's from South Florida, should have been a Hurricane, is playing at a high level. They get Hollywood Smothers back, their running back. This game concerns me. I think if Miami is able to get that lead early, stay balanced, shouldn't be a problem. But if they stub their toe, NC State gets out early, I just worry about Miami being able to play from behind with Carson Beck. He has not demonstrated the ability to kind of, navigate some challenges throughout the game, because obviously, in these contests, you don't always get, the highs. Sometimes there are some lows, there's some valleys in that play. And his ability to kind of galvanize the team and not compound issues when issues do arise is what concerns me the most. So of course, I'm going to be watching the dual screen because I do want to see Ty Simpson, but got to watch the Canes, Mr. C. My dog's still feeling reeling, I guess, from Michigan going to deal with some injuries. Yeah. Tough loss last week. We'll talk about a coach leaving the last 2 weeks. Could be a distraction. That's true. Can't rule that out. All right. One that I think, folks shouldn't sleep on is this Iowa USC. So as you can see, Iowa is ranked. They are tough. They play everybody hard. Everybody. Iowa is not a walk in the park. They are physical and they actually have some offense for a change. So USC needs to buckle the chin strap if they want to come away with a win and keep their college football playoffs hopes alive. What else we got here? I think that's it for the 3:30 window. Ole Miss, UF. Good football players in those games, not necessarily great teams in my mind. Ole Miss is ranked 7th, but I just never know what version of the Rebels we're going to see. Right, from week to week, they could look like one of the better teams in the country, right? A top 10 team, top 7 team in this case, or an unranked team, right? And I'm sure you could say that about any number of college football teams, but Ole Miss is a bit of a enigma for me. UF, of course, they moved off of Billy Napier, which I'm excited about because now we can go pilfer players from that roster. The Gators have a lot of talent. No question about it, whether it be underclassmen or guys that are going to be heading into the 2026 NFL draft. A lot of talent on that roster. So that's the reason why I'm just kind of like, you never know. Ole Miss is at home. They should take care of business because, UF has been wildly inconsistent, certainly at the quarterback position, but you just simply never know. Utah Baylor might be an interesting one too there in the 7 o'clock window. Might be an interesting one there. Ohio State plays UCLA late. That's going to be a one-sided affair. Ohio State hasn't played anybody this year, man. Right? I mean, they look great. Don't get me wrong. They've had a couple games where they just kind of been slow out the gate, and then they turn it on in the second half. They are a second half team, and I wonder if that's going to catch up with them when they face Michigan at the end of the year. But until they play Michigan, until they play the Big Ten championship, they don't play anybody. Right. The Texas game was supposed to be the one, and that didn't necessarily, materialize because of, Arch wasn't ready, clearly. The Penn State game, if I'm not mistaken, of course, Penn State, fell apart. Drew Aller got hurt. Franklin dismissed as head coach. So really and truly, Ohio State hasn't been tested. Washington maybe had been their best test. And of course, Washington isn't quite as good, unfortunately, Mississippi, as we thought they might be. So, yeah, I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for this Ohio State team to be tested. That said, a lot of talent. Caleb Downs, obviously. Arvell Reese, been probably the biggest eye opener among prospects. Carnell Lake certainly making a case to be, among the top receivers selected. So, ton of talent. Ohio State is a talent-laden roster, but certainly I don't know that they have the same depth that they had a season ago. That may no longer be the case because we're this far into the year, so guys are experienced now and they have that championship pedigree. So may not necessarily be an issue anymore, but they've yet to be tested. Texas, Georgia. Again, you want to talk about potential 2026 NFL draft prospects. You don't have to look any further. This game will be chock full of them. Chock full of them. I like the way Gunnar Stockton has been playing. I can understand why they decided to move off of Carson Beck. Arch Manning has been better as of late. He's starting to play a little bit better. A little disappointed in their running game, Texas's running game. So hopefully they can get on track. I think Georgia handled Texas the last season. I think they played twice, or was it the other way around? I don't remember. The days are starting to bleed together, but certainly one to certainly tune into here in the SEC, Texas at Georgia later in the evening. And I think for my purposes, I'll probably watch the BYU TCU game as well. But for my purposes, I think those are the games of note that I would be most interested in. All right. Okay, so that's going to do it for this week's college football slate. And of course, touch on a few of the various prospects. There's a player that I want to give some love, and I'll probably do a video breakdown on him at some point. I've been working on a Fernando Mendoza breakdown for the better part of 6 weeks now. And as I mentioned, part of the reason why I've been so inconsistent with the content is because life has obviously reared its ugly head. That said, certainly trying to get back on track. Keionte Scott is not playing in this game. Keionte Scott is going to be injured, and he is the really impressive nickel DB for Miami, transfer from Auburn. I mean, outside of Ruben Bain and Akeem Mesidor, been our best player, right? Arguably our best player on either side of the ball. So really going to miss that guy. And it's, again, part of the reason why I'm very concerned about this matchup tomorrow. All right, Mr. C. Let me bring it in here tight. I want to take a look at a pair of mock drafts you did. All right. And of course, because I have been behind the 8 ball in terms of updating our mock draft simulator, Mr. C has done a couple of mock drafts on the PFN simulator, but we're going to review them regardless because Mr. C always shows up. All right. So what we got here, Mr. C? No trades. Obviously, you move some draft capital in order to acquire Rashid Shaheed. In this particular mock draft, you went with Kamari Ramsey in the first. You followed that up with Caleb Banks in the second. You had to get your guy Tacario Davis. I understand it. And then Jake Slaughter, right, to play the pivot. I like it. I like it, all things considered, because you don't have a lot of draft capital because, you're obviously trying to make a run here, pushing your chips to the middle of the table. You can add Shaheed to this draft class effectively, assuming you extend him. But Ramsey is a playmaker on the back end of the defense. I love Caleb Banks. I know he's dealt with injuries this year, but I'm probably the highest on Caleb Banks, despite the fact that Drew is a Gator on the second half draft show. He's a first-round talent in my mind in this particular class. Maybe not necessarily have the tape and certainly dealing with the injury, but first-round talent. So you get him towards the end of the second round. I think that's great value there. Tacario Davis, I see what you're trying to do here. You're trying to get the big corner, the Brandon Browner type of deal, what have you. I see what you're working on here, Mr. C. What's going on, Dana? How you doing? I like it. So I think your thought process is Reek is out, so you bring in Takaria, right? That makes sense. That makes sense. And then Jake Slaughter, right? You can go back to those way too early mock drafts, and Jake Slaughter was a trendy first round selection. So you managed to get a quality center, maybe not necessarily having his best season. The Gators clearly aren't having their best season. But you get a guy who I think could eventually be your starter. Maybe not year one, but certainly could eventually be your starter at that point in the draft, late in the draft. That looks like a 6th round pick there, fifth, 6th round pick. I like it. I like it, Dana. I'm with you. This is a quality mock draft for sure. All right. So this one was light, Mr. C, because like I said, obviously the trades at the deadline. But I know you got another one teed up where you did some deals. You moved around the board a little bit. So let's see what that one looks like. Okay. So I suspect several trade downs in this one. Hey, Dana, what's the plan at QB? What's the plan at QB? That's what I'm trying to understand. Aren't we all, Dana? Just one day at a time. That's all I can say. One day at a time. Chris Bell. Chris Bell, Mr. C. Yeah, I'm on board. I think Henley and Drew were probably a little ahead of me on the Chris Bell tip, but that frame and that kind of speed is really impressive. You think about it, you add Bell to a JSN, you get Torrey Horton healthy, and then potentially, I'm not sure if they will go this route, potentially re-up with Shaheed. I really like those top 4 receivers under those circumstances. I know Bell is a handful, man. I mean, you can hit him on the mesh route, and he'll take it the distance. He'll break a tackle and take it the distance. NFL frame, 6'2", 220, and he's a blur. So I like the first round selection there. Daryl Jackson. All right. So I see, you trade out of the 2nd round, you add an additional third. Um, it seems maybe a fourth on top of that. Daryl Jackson he's intriguing. He definitely is intriguing. Of course, former Hurricane. He's from, I think, North Florida, transferred up to Florida State to be closer to I believe his mother. His mother was ill. Makes sense. Makes sense. I don't think the film is a day 2 prospect, but certainly the physical tools are that of a day 2 prospect, right? And I think based on those traits and how he performs during the pre-draft process, he could very well find himself selected in the first 3 rounds, right? He kind of has that kind of that, as Bill Nagy mentioned, it's still a genetics league to a certain degree, right? To be that big, that physical, be a quality athlete, maybe not necessarily the technique and the motor you want, but there's certainly some physical tools, traits that John Schneider might be really interested in there. Jaden Roberts makes a ton of sense. I know what you're trying to do there. I know you're trying to solidify the interior of that offensive line. You've been at it for a while, Mr. C. So I like that selection, and I really like the Damani Jackson selection as well. He's playing some really good football. I would be surprised if he lasts as long as 125. That would actually surprise me. And I expect his, aside from, the physical testing not going great or something like that, I definitely think he goes in the first 2 days of the draft. Dad's a former Seahawk. Yes, he is. His dad is a former Seahawk. There's no plan. Pence's offense is limited without Peyton Adams elevating the O-line. Probably trade K when to bring someone in and draft mid to late. Yeah, I was working on a mock draft, Dana, and I was trying to figure out what to do with Arizona, right? Where could you trade Kyler Murray, where a team could absorb that contract and also net the kind of draft capital you would expect of, still relatively young quarterback, right? Relatively speaking. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I'm still trying to kind of figure out. I thought, well, maybe Las Vegas, Pete Carroll had, success with a shorter quarterback and Russell Wilson, different body type, but certainly, not the prototypical quarterback. Maybe that might be a way to go about it. What does that look like in terms of where, draft capital, first round, so on and so forth? So that's what I'm trying to kind of work on and get out to the public. Interesting. But yeah, I do think Kyler Murray, for all intents and purposes, is done in Arizona. I do. The Dolphins take on Murray's contract. Like, I don't think Murray plays with the rhythm and timing that Mike McDaniel is going to want. Right? I just don't see it that way. Um, could we see a situation where they swap? I doubt that. I highly doubt that, because Murray does not play with the, like I said, the timing and the precision that offense, that Mike McDaniel offense, assuming he remains the head coach, requires. Right? I think there's a bit more ad libbing, and you have to do certain things in order to create that line of sight for Murray, because he's not very tall. Tua is not super tall either, but Murray is very short. It's just the reality of it, and I think we have to come to terms with the fact that it impacts their offense. He's a unique athlete. He's able to get himself out of trouble in most instances, what have you. But I think it does limit what you do. And given the fact that, in this particular offense, you want it 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, ball out, ball placement, so on and so forth. I just don't know that Murray would be a great fit under those circumstances. You stay in the secondary here, Mississippi, with Xavier Nwankpa and DJ McKinney. So you're really loading up on the back end here on day 3 of the draft. And I think those are all quality football players, right? I think they could, find a role in the Seattle secondary sooner rather than later. Of course, you got Love, you got Emmanuel, who's playing out of his mind. But just the way Mike McDaniel kind of does, not Mike McDaniel, Mike Macdonald goes about leveraging the various pieces on his defense. I could see all those guys playing a role relatively early in their careers. And then, you go with another kind of size speed combination, or the size speed combo in this class of Nichols Harbor. We've talked about him ad nauseum, certainly during summer scouting. Big time athlete, big time athlete. You can't teach size and speed of that nature, but just not a natural football player. So at this point in the draft, that's exactly what you're looking for. You're looking for those, physical outliers, right? As far as on the high end of the spectrum, not necessarily on the low end, right? You're betting on traits. They're probably better football players, guys with better film on the board at this point, but they don't necessarily have the physical tools that a Nichols Harbor has. So you roll the dice on that. So I think at this point that makes a lot of sense. When you start talking about Nichols Harbor on the day 2 of the draft, early day 3, I'm a little reluctant. I think day 3 you can certainly start having the conversation, but at 197, I think that's perfect. I think that makes a ton of sense. So I like it. Good stuff, Mr. C. All right. I think I'm gonna wrap it up there, guys. I'm a little under the weather, I'm sure, as you've heard. I've enjoyed it. I want to get back to it on a consistent basis, and I will at some point here. We're gonna get the content going on a consistent basis. Dana, Mississippi, I thank you for joining me this evening for this truncated, quick show. I'm gonna see if I can find Headley and Drew, drag them onto the show. See if we can get back to square one with things. So you guys have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully I'll see you next week. Take care.